I remember one point we went downstairs basement when Tim turned on the lights and I looked and there was just a ton of keys on this wall. I mean, probably 150, 200 sets of keys. And I said, does your dad have a fascination with collecting keys or something like that? He said, no, those are the keys to all the rental properties that we own. Hey, it's Nathan Crockett here. Wanted to tell you a story from many years ago that I think has really helped me out in the business world. And that is, I was doing a church internship. I think this was the summer after my junior year at Bob Jones University. So it would have been probably 2001, something like that. So many, many years ago. And I was at a small little town in Illinois. There were 900 people in the town. I think as I came into the town, I was kind of feeling like, you drive into this town, it said the name of the town and 900 population. I kind of wanted to put 901 because I was going to be there for the whole summer. The town was basically a 1 mile by 1 mile square. Myself and the other church intern ended up staying with a widow lady who lived on one side of the town, and we could walk to the church. It was kind of on the other corner of town. There were actually no stoplights in this town. It was a little bit like Mayberry, if you've ever watched the Andy Griffith Show. So interesting little town, great church. A lot of people from that town went to the church. There's a Baptist church there. And then people from some of the surrounding towns. I made many, many friends that summer of people in that church. But one of them was a very interesting family. This man, I think, was a deacon in the church. And in fact, that summer, he had a couple health needs, and I went and visited him in the hospital and so on. But just really a very, very quiet, godly man. But one time the pastor said, hey, can I take you to this house and of this family? And there's a son who's kind of high school age, and he's really good with technology. And he's doing a PowerPoint for a big church banquet that we have. And it's taken him longer than he expected. And I know you're kind of good with computers or whatever. And again, this is 23, 24 years ago. And I said, sure, yeah, I'd love to do that. So the pastor took me over there. I don't remember if it was lunchtime maybe or so that I went over there. And this project ended up taking so long because back then you'd have a scanner and then it took forever to upload large file images. And we were trying to put a few hundred pictures in this PowerPoint, kind of the year in review type of thing, or I think for a big banquet that was going on. It was the first time I remember staying at someone's house. We worked actually all through the night, kind of pulled an all-nighter, and I hadn't hardly done that, maybe a couple times for youth group activities as a teenager, but really got to know this family well. The son and I are still friends to this day. He's been a very, very successful businessman. But I remember while we were doing that, at one point we went to get something, I think from their downstairs basement. And when we did, I looked when Tim turned on the lights, and I looked and there was just a ton of keys on this wall. I mean, probably 150, 200 sets of keys. And I said, does your dad have a fascination with collecting keys or something like that? He said, no, those are the keys to all the rental properties that we own. And I realized that this family in the town they were in owned much of the real estate that was there. And again, this is 20 some years ago. There were like 6 monitors all hooked together because I think he would do day trading as well. And I came to find that even though this family was very unassuming and quiet and lived in an older home and drove older vehicles, Dad was very, very successful. And in fact, his son was very successful. He was probably 17 at the time and was getting close to becoming a millionaire, I think, through his computer business. I think he had one of the first 3-letter domains, and then also through a lawn business that maybe he had sold. And again, to this day, he's a few years younger than me, but he's a very, very successful businessman and entrepreneur. And somewhere in there, I mean, you start to lose track of time when you're pulling an all-nighter. And I can't remember if I was scanning things and giving them to Tim and he was putting them in the PowerPoint, but we were both working on it. It was a lot of fun. It was kind of a fun project to get together. But maybe it was the next morning at breakfast, maybe it was dinner, maybe it was lunch the next day. Somewhere in there, I had the opportunity to talk with Tim's dad. And again, he was very soft-spoken, very unassuming. You had to really ask questions to get things out of him. And I just remember telling him that I was impressed that he owned all those rental properties. And, his son had relayed that he had made a lot of money in the stock market. And I just said, someday I would like to, I'm studying to be a pastor, but I would love to own businesses someday or buy real estate. Is there any advice that you would have for me? And I remember as I talked to that gentleman, he probably told me 2 or 3 different things. But the one thing that really stood out in my mind that I actually tried to later put into practice was that gentleman said, Nathan, don't ever be afraid to ask. And he gave me several different situations where maybe he had thought, oh, that'd be a good home to buy, or that could be a good rental property. And he didn't want to. He was kind of nervous. He was kind of shy. He was an introvert like I am. But he just forced himself to go and ask. And time after time after time, he didn't always get it, or maybe someone was selling a property and he said, wow, I would like that property if it was $40,000 cheaper. And he said, don't be afraid to ask. Never be afraid to ask. And I remember partway through that summer, there was another man in the church who was very well off, and he was a collector. He had an Abraham Lincoln signature. He had guns from, I think, every different American war, even the Civil War, incredible collections. And he also had quite the car collection. He had a really fancy Bentley. He had a convertible Jaguar. He had all these different cars. And when I was over at his house at one point, he said, you're our intern and you're having to walk all around this 1 mile square town. And I want to loan you this car. And it was, his mom had passed away and it was her old Cadillac. And so that summer I drove around that town in this big, it was looked like a giant black boat almost, this really big Cadillac, which was interesting for me. And I remember as I thought about the other gentleman's advice, the very quiet, unassuming gentleman who'd said, don't be afraid to ask. When it finally got to the end of that summer, I thought, the guy who loaned me this car, he has a whole collection of cars. This was his mom's car. She passed away. And maybe I should ask if I can buy it from him. And so I think I looked up the blue book value and tried to figure out what was a fair price. And I had the money that I could do that. And so I remember I didn't want to. It felt kind of awkward and so on. But I sat him down and I kind of made my case and said, I think this is what the car's worth. And you have all these other cars. Is there any way I could buy this car from you for such and such price? And he looked at me and he said, no, I'm not going to let you do that. And I said, okay, oh, that's fine. No problem. I just figured I'd ask. And he said, I'm not going to let you do that because I'm going to give you the car. And I said, no, I'm not. I can't let you give me the car. You have to sell it to me. That wouldn't be fair to you. I think this is a fair price. This is the blue book value. Please sell it to me for this. And we went back and forth. And he finally said, well, if you insist that you have to buy it, I'll sell it to you. But the maximum you can pay me is $1. So I ended up getting my first car. That was actually my car, not my parents' car, was an old black Cadillac that I got for $1. Partly and largely because my friend had told me, hey, never be afraid to ask. So I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about 5 different areas in which it really helps as an entrepreneur or small business owner to be willing to ask. What are some things that you can learn by being willing to ask? The first area I want to talk about, number 1, is mentorship. I think many times, because I spend a lot of time with college students, and I spend a lot of time with people in the business world who are older than college students. And I think many college students would like a mentor. They want somebody who's in the business world, or people who are studying for pastoral ministry, want somebody who's a pastor, and they think, I want to be mentored. I want someone who's gone ahead of me, but they're all so busy and so on. Don't be afraid to ask. Maybe you're on LinkedIn, maybe you're on another social media platform, and there's somebody that you really respect, you honor. And again, probably Warren Buffett's probably not going to take a day to take you out to dinner or something like that. But there may be very successful business people in the city that you live in. And in many cases, if you're serious and you're in earnest about this and you're a serious, let's say, young person, don't be afraid to ask. The number 1 area I think this can really help you out in is in acquiring mentors and finding people that can really help train you. If you're a believer, help disciple you. So don't be afraid to ask someone if they would take the time to mentor you, or if you could take them out for a meal and you could pick their brain about things. Don't be afraid to ask. A second area that I think it can be really helpful is with networking. As an introvert, I've never been a big fan of networking. People say that your network is your net worth. And I've kind of, especially in college and so on, I sort of pushed back on that. And I thought you really need to have the skill set yourself to be good for a job. Not just, people say it doesn't matter what you know, it only matters who you know. But the older I get, the more I realize the value of a network and how the friends that God has brought around my life have made such a difference in my life. Don't be afraid to ask, how can that help you with your network? Well, for one thing, as you have the opportunity to meet people, ask them questions. Be curious. I think one of the best things for an entrepreneur or small business owner is curiosity. They say curiosity killed the cat. My kids, there was a cat up here where we live on Paris Mountain that's kind of tried to adopt my kids lately. They keep feeding it and it's probably never going to go away. But I love the fact that they love animals. But they say curiosity killed the cat. I don't know about that, but curiosity is usually what makes or breaks an entrepreneur or small business owner. So be curious, ask open-ended questions, and that networking, that might be with a future partner that you might run a business with. It could be with a future client. It might be with an investor. Maybe you're looking for someone to invest in your startup. And as you are not afraid to ask, it can really help you significantly with networking. So mentorship, networking. A third area that can really help you is problem solving. If you're not too afraid to ask, that can help you get to root causes. Oftentimes we see a fruit problem. Here's this problem out here, and that's the fruit. Our sales are down. We're burning through cash, whatever that particular problem is. But you want to ask deeper questions and try to find out what's the root of that. Because maybe there's something we're doing wrong in this particular area that's affecting all the way up here. So don't be afraid to ask, particularly if you're a business owner, whether you have 3 employees or 3,000 employees. Ask the difficult questions to try to find out what root causes are. That's going to help you with problem solving. A second thing that will help with problem solving is brainstorming. When you're brainstorming, when you're in a room and maybe you have a room with just whiteboards on the wall, or I like to brainstorm even with ChatGPT or Gemini, just ask lots of questions, throw things against the wall, get ideas. No idea is too dumb. That's going to help you a lot as you brainstorm. Another idea with problem solving is you want to be able to look at the pros and cons of alternative things. So you take one of your businesses and you say, hey, we're doing such and such. So maybe with tarps.com, certain ones of our items we just drop ship. Other things we have that are all made in the USA. We've imported certain things from China. And for instance, recently we were looking at importing certain things from India. So maybe we'd say, well, here's what we've been doing from China. But what would be the alternatives to import those same items or similar items from India? What would be the advantage of China versus India? So we could list out the pros and cons of China and then the pros and cons of India when we're looking at the quality of the fabric and we're looking at tariffs and we're looking at shipping costs and the speed of shipping, all these different things. A lot of times not being afraid to ask means you're willing to say, hey, we've done it this way for 10 years or 20 years, or tarps.com is more than 30 years old. This was a business I bought several years ago. And just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean that we should continue to do it that way. So weighing the pros and cons of the alternatives, don't be afraid to ask. Another thing that's going to be really helpful to you is to be willing to question the status quo. Oftentimes we get so used to the status quo. Well, why do you do that? Well, that's what everyone else does. Well, everyone else gets a mortgage. Everyone else pays it off over 30 years. People do this and they do this and they do this. And if you're an entrepreneur, part of that is probably being willing to question the status quo and say, just because everyone else does it this way, doesn't mean I'm going to do it that way. I tend to see myself as a contrarian investor in the stock market. Even oftentimes with real estate, when no one else is buying land, that's usually when I'm going to buy land because it's at the best deal. Some of the most money I've ever made in stocks is something that was neglected. I'm not looking for the stock that everyone else is buying when I'm afraid I'll probably end up buying it at the top. I want to look at the neglected stocks. What are the stocks that have dropped and why did they drop? And oftentimes there's a very good reason, but many times the case was overstated or the reaction was far too severe for what it should have been. That stock should have dropped 20% based on that report and it dropped 60%. Okay, maybe I want to buy that because I'm willing to question the status quo. It's something you want to do and never being afraid to ask. So mentorship, networking, problem solving. A fourth area is when it comes to negotiating. When I talked about buying that Cadillac, not being afraid to ask and just say, hey, here's the Blue Book value. Is there any way we can do this? In many ways, that was a negotiation. So if you're not afraid to ask, one thing that's going to help you with is getting to the table in the first place. Maybe there's a property that you drive by every day and you think, I would love to live on that property. Find out who the owner is. Just have a chat with them. Call them up. I could give you examples of this from my own life when I wasn't afraid to ask. I think of a time when my wife and I were newly married and we lived on a little bit of acreage, but there was somebody that owned more than 12 acres behind us, and it went down to a river. So for us to go down to the river to play in the river with our dogs and so on, we had to cut through that man's acreage. And so I looked it up, I found out who he was, was able to call him up, get him on the phone and just say, hey, if you're ever interested in selling that land, 12.09 acres behind us, I'd be really interested in buying that. And he was actually very nice. I found out, I did some research. That's another thing. If you're not afraid to ask whoever the negotiating party is that you're negotiating with, you can do a little bit of research. Found out that he owned dozens, I think actually over 100 properties in the area. And this property was not probably very valuable to him because it was mainly recreational property, because part of it was in a floodplain. And so I just asked, I told him how much we loved the property. It was beautiful. We loved when the trees changed colors and so on. I didn't try to run down the property or pretend like it was worthless. And he could tell I was a young guy, newly married. I'd bought my first house as a, foreclosure and was able to pay cash for it. And we were fixing that up. And he was super nice. And he just said, look, and this was years ago, maybe, I guess probably about almost 20 years ago, maybe 18 years ago. And he said, Nathan, you seem like a nice young man. I'm happy for you to walk through my property to get to the river. That's awesome. Love for you to do that. Thanks for asking about that. And yeah, I'd be interested in selling. He said, if you've priced anything around here, just typical acreage, if it's not in a nice area, anything in Greenville County, kind of farmland or whatever is probably $20,000 an acre. But, that's more recreational property. A lot of it's in a floodplain. And so, yeah, I'd sell it to you for $5,000 an acre. I think that's a good deal for you. Just over 12 acres would be $60,000 and some change. And again, I was newly married at the time. We'd put our money in our home. I wasn't making much money. Again, 20 years ago. And I remember telling him, wow, that sounds like probably a great price. I haven't really, other than the home I bought, I'm wanting to buy some more real estate and get into real estate. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. And I really appreciate it. And I'll plan to try to save up some money and call you back later. And I actually said, I feel kind of stupid right now because really, I probably shouldn't even be talking to you because I always keep cash in the bank and I don't really believe in debt. And I like to have a buffer of cash, which is a certain amount. And so I said, probably, honestly, what I have beyond that buffer right now would be like $6,000. So it's like 1/10 of what the property's worth. And I'm sure it's worth at least $60,000. So when I save up a lot more and get closer to 60, I'll call you up because right now all I've got is about $6,000. But thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful talking to you. Wish you all the best. It was just a very cordial conversation. And I don't remember if it was later that day or the next day that he called me back and he said, you know what, I've been thinking about this. All I do on that property is pay taxes on it. And he said, you mentioned kind of in passing that you like to keep, I don't even remember if it was a $10,000 or $15,000 buffer, but beyond that, all you had was $6,000, which is, $500 an acre for those 12 acres. And he said, I know that this is from a real estate standpoint, this is really stupid of me, but I'm not using the property at all. And you're a really nice guy. You didn't run down my property at all. I appreciate that. I'll sell you the property for $6,000. And it later on down the road, he even offered to pay all the closing costs. So it would be exactly $6,000 for me to buy over 12 acres in Greenville. And again, that was years ago, but obviously, even back then it was worth way, way more than that. So don't be afraid to ask. When it comes to negotiating, always look for the win-win. And a lot of times it can help you come to a compromise, right? This party wants this, you want this. And part of becoming successful in business and in life is sometimes being willing to reach a compromise. Now, as a Christian, there are certain theological issues where I don't believe that we should ever compromise. But in business and in many things in life, we need to be willing to negotiate. So not being afraid to ask can oftentimes help you with negotiation. It can even help you as you try to close the deal, right? Sometimes people are negotiating, or maybe you work for someone who owns a small business and maybe they're getting older and about to retire. Maybe their kids don't want anything to do with that plumbing or electrical business. And for you, it's just a matter of maybe you've talked multiple times with the owner of the business about what it might look like for him to someday sell to you. And he's thrown things around and he hints at things. And sometimes the best way to to really close a deal is just to be willing to ask and to just say, this is an incredible business that you've built. And I know you've said before, someday you'd maybe like to sell it for this. I think I might be the perfect person to buy it. I recognize the value here more than someone else would. And particularly if you'd be willing to do some owner financing for part of it, here's a deal we could get to. So sometimes that willingness to ask can even help you close a deal. So with mentorship, networking, problem solving, negotiating, all of these are areas where you can't be afraid to ask. The fifth thing I would mention, and we'll close with this one, right? There's a whole world of things out there. And if you're not afraid to ask, in summary, in many ways, what that is that's being curious. I think curiosity is one of the best things for an entrepreneur. They say curiosity killed the cat. I don't know about that. I know even last night, where we live up on Paris Mountain, there was a cat that came and my kids started feeding it and so on. So sure enough, this morning, the cat is still there. We're more of a dog family than a cat family, but I'm glad that my kids are helping out this cat. I don't know if curiosity killed the cat or not, but curiosity is vital for an entrepreneur or a small business owner. You are going to be willing to grow so much more if you're willing to ask questions. Sometimes you're in a meeting, you're in a discussion, you're in a negotiation, and there's something that maybe everyone in the room is thinking about. Maybe it's the elephant in the room. Be the person who's willing to just stand up and ask. Just ask the tough questions, ask. And again, don't be a jerk about it. Don't be mean about it. But in a very nice way, you can ask the question that maybe everybody else was thinking about. That's going to help you grow. It's going to help you overcome obstacles. There are so many opportunities, even on YouTube, for online courses, for free resources. Maybe for someone, it means going back to university, maybe taking an online class. Maybe getting a reading plan of several books to read through. And you might say, I'm too busy to read. Maybe as a business owner, you should be too busy not to read, right? There's so many mistakes you can avoid falling into if you're not afraid to ask, if you're curious. I'm so appreciative that 20 some years ago, I sat in someone's dining room table after pulling an all-nighter, working with his son to help get this presentation ready, and just asked him different questions about what does it mean to be a successful business person. And the one answer he gave me that stands out more than all the others was, Nathan, never be afraid to ask.